Today we're talking about the story of Abraham Lincoln, a man who started with almost nothing and became one of the greatest leaders in history. Imagine being born in a small log cabin with little money, little schooling, and big dreams. Most people would have thought, there's no way I can succeed. But Lincoln didn't give up. He read, he worked hard, and he believed that one person could make a difference. This story is not just about history. It is about courage, determination, and the power of learning. Just like Lincoln learned and grew step by step, you can improve your English little by little. So let's dive into the life of Abraham Lincoln and see how a boy from a humble cabin grew to change a nation, and how his story can inspire you to learn, speak, and dream in English. On a cold February morning in 1809, Abraham Lincoln entered the world in a home so simple that its cracks let the wind whistle straight through the walls. No one watching that frail baby boy could have imagined he would one day lead a nation through its darkest hour. And yet, it is exactly from these rough beginnings that his character was forged. Lincoln's family lived a hard life. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a struggling farmer, moving from one patch of land to another, trying to make ends meet. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was known for her quiet strength and gentle spirit. The Lincolns weren't wealthy. In fact, they had almost nothing. Poverty was the constant backdrop of Abraham's childhood, and survival was the daily mission. But what they lacked in money, they made up for in resilience. As a boy, Abraham grew up on the frontier, surrounded by endless forests, wild animals, and the constant challenge of farm work. Life demanded toughness. He helped chop wood, build fences, and tend to crops. Work came early, and play was rare. The little boy who would one day command generals and debate, statesman first learned discipline with an axe in his hands and dirt under his fingernails. But there was something different about him. While many children of the frontier saw no world beyond their farm, young Abraham's mind reached further. He was curious, hungry to learn, and fascinated by words. He had less than a year of formal schooling in his entire youth, but he devoured every scrap of knowledge he could find. Books were rare luxuries, but when he managed to borrow one, he read it by the dim light of a fireplace, long after the day's work was done. He taught himself through sheer determination. The Bible, Aesop's fables, Shakespeare, these became his teachers. Tragedy struck early in Lincoln's life. When he was just 9 years old, his mother Nancy died of a terrible sickness known as milk sickness, caused by poisoned plants eaten by cows. Losing her left a hole in Abraham's heart that never truly healed. Yet even in this heartbreak, the seeds of resilience were planted. His stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston, entered his life soon after. Unlike the harsh stepmother of fairy tales, Sarah became a source of love and encouragement. She recognized Abraham's thirst for learning and encouraged him to keep reading, to keep growing. She later said she never had a child who was more dutiful than Abraham. What makes Lincoln's story so inspiring is not just where he ended up, but how he started. He had no advantages, no wealth, no connections, no formal education. Just a boy from the backwoods who refused to let his environment limit his potential. Every night spent with a borrowed book, every moment working the land, every challenge he faced, these became building blocks of character. It's easy to look back now and see Abraham Lincoln as a giant of history. But in those early years he was just a tall, awkward boy in ragged clothes, fighting to rise above circumstances that could have easily kept him down. And yet, that's the beauty of his beginning. His log cabin story reminds us that greatness doesn't require a perfect start. It requires grit, vision, and an unshakable will to rise. Abraham Lincoln's journey from that little log cabin in Kentucky to the highest office in the land is proof of one powerful truth. It's not where you're born that defines you. It's how far you're willing to go. Part 2. A self-educated young man. Education isn't something handed to you. It's something you can chase, even when the odds are stacked against you. Abraham Lincoln proved this truth with every fiber of his being. He didn't grow up with classrooms, teachers, or libraries filled with books. He grew up with dirt floors, hard labor, and borrowed scraps of paper. Yet, somehow, out of this unlikely setting, a brilliant mind was shaped, a mind that would one day command the attention of an entire nation. Young Lincoln was not a boy of privilege, but he was a boy of restless curiosity. Whenever he could, he read. It didn't matter what the book was: history, poetry, law, or even farming guides. He absorbed it all, treating every sentence like a treasure. Friends and neighbors would later recall how Abraham walked for miles just to borrow a single book, then stayed up late by firelight, tracing every word until he understood it. For him, reading wasn't just an escape from farm life. It was a ladder out of poverty and obscurity. Of course, books alone didn't pay the bills. Lincoln's teenage and young adult years were filled with odd jobs that tested both his strength and his character. He worked as a rail splitter, spending long days under the hot sun chopping wood and building fences. His strong arms and towering frame made him well suited for the work, but his mind was always somewhere else, pondering ideas, telling stories, and asking questions. Later he found work as a store clerk. It was in that little store that his personality began to shine. It was in that little store that his personality began to shine. Customers noticed something unusual about the tall, lanky young man behind the counter: his honesty. If he shortchanged someone by accident, he would walk miles to return the missing pennies. People started calling him Honest Abe, a nickname that would stick with him forever. More importantly, this store gave Lincoln something priceless: practice in dealing with people. He learned how to listen, how to persuade, and how to connect, skills that would one day serve him on much bigger stages. When the opportunity came, Lincoln also tried his hand at surveying land. With nothing more than self-study and determination, he taught himself geometry and measurement. Imagine that, a boy with almost no formal schooling, mastering technical skills because he refused to be limited by what he didn't know. It was this pattern: see a challenge, learn what's needed, apply it, that became the heartbeat of his life. But perhaps the most important development during these years was his discovery of the law and his gift for public speaking. Lincoln loved to argue not out of pride, but out of a fascination with truth and reason. He read law books carefully, often carrying them in his pockets while working. At night, he studied cases by candlelight, teaching himself legal principles without the guidance of professors. He was quite literally building his future with borrowed books and relentless effort. As for speaking, he became a natural storyteller and debater. In fields, at gatherings, and in local debates, Lincoln's voice carried. People noticed how he could simplify complex ideas, how he could make others laugh, and how he spoke with a sincerity that drew listeners in. He wasn't polished yet, but the raw talent was undeniable. The boy who once split rails for a living was now splitting arguments with sharp words and clear thinking. What shines through Lincoln's early manhood is his refusal to be trapped by circumstance. He didn't let his lack of schooling define him. He didn't let poverty silence him. Instead, he turned every job into a lesson, every book into a stepping stone, every moment of practice into preparation for something greater. Chapter 3. First Steps into Politics. Every great leader has a moment when private ambition collides with public opportunity. For Abraham Lincoln, that turning point came when he stepped onto the rough and tumble stage of politics in Illinois. He was no longer just the rail splitter or the store clerk. He was a man with ideas, a man with a voice, and a man determined to use both to shape the world around him. In 1830, the Lincoln family moved once again, this time to Illinois. Abraham, now in his early 20s, was restless. He had tasted the thrill of learning and speaking, and he wanted more than just farm work or odd jobs. Illinois, with its growing towns and its lively debates about the future of America, offered him something his log cabin childhood never could, a chance to make his mark. It didn't take long for Lincoln to step into the political arena. In 1832, he announced his candidacy for the Illinois state legislature. Imagine it, a tall, awkward, self-taught young man with little formal education and no family connections, daring to run for public office. Most people would have dismissed him as a dreamer, but Lincoln had something that made him stand out, an unshakable belief in the power of hard work and honesty. That first campaign was tough. Lincoln was unknown to many, and though he lost, he gained something far more valuable: recognition. People began to notice his sincerity, his ability to connect with ordinary folks, and his knack for explaining issues in plain, powerful language. He didn't win the seat, but he won respect, and that would carry him forward. 2 years later, in 1834, Lincoln tried again. This time he succeeded, winning a seat in the Illinois House of Representatives. For the next 8 years he would serve in the state legislature, sharpening his skills as both a politician and a debater. It was here, in those crowded halls of Springfield, that Lincoln's reputation began to grow. He was known for his sharp wit and sharp mind, but above all for his honesty. While others played politics for personal gain, Lincoln spoke plainly, sometimes too plainly for comfort, but always with integrity. He earned a reputation as a man whose word could be trusted, a rare quality in any age. But honesty alone wasn't what made him stand out. It was his ability to debate. In an era when speeches weren't just political tools but public entertainment, Lincoln's words commanded attention. He could dismantle an opponent's argument with clarity, then turn around and make an audience laugh with a well-timed story. He wasn't the most polished speaker yet, but he had a gift. He made complicated issues feel simple and personal. People didn't just hear him, they understood him. At the same time, Lincoln was building friendships and connections that would shape his future. He studied law more seriously, often reading in the back rooms of the legislature, determined to rise beyond his humble beginnings. Slowly, the rail splitter from Kentucky was transforming into a respected voice in Illinois politics. What's inspiring about this chapter of Lincoln's life is that it shows how persistence and character create opportunity. He failed at first, but he didn't quit. He lacked wealth, yet he leaned on honesty. He lacked formal education, yet he armed himself with knowledge. Step by step, he proved that leadership isn't about where you come from. It's about what you stand for. By the time his service in the Illinois legislature came to an end, Abraham Lincoln was no longer just a young man with big dreams. He was a rising figure, a politician who had carved a place for himself through grit, words, and an unshakable belief that he had something to contribute. And soon his voice would grow far louder than Illinois could contain. Chapter 4. The Lawyer of Springfield. Sometimes the path to greatness isn't a straight line. It's built brick by brick, case by case, and choice by choice. For Abraham Lincoln, the years in Springfield weren't about battles and speeches yet. They were about laying the foundation, becoming a lawyer, starting a family, and learning to balance ambition with responsibility. This was the season where he transformed from a young dreamer into a man people trusted with their problems, their votes, and even their hearts. By the mid-1830s, Lincoln had already made a name for himself in the Illinois legislature. But he knew that if he wanted to rise higher, he needed a profession that would both sharpen his mind and support his future. Law was the obvious choice. True to his self-taught nature, Lincoln didn't go to law school. He sat down with borrowed books, studied relentlessly, and prepared himself for the bar exam. In 1836, he officially became a licensed lawyer. Springfield, Illinois, became the stage where he built his career. At first, Lincoln partnered with other lawyers, but soon he was handling cases of all kinds: property disputes, business contracts, even criminal defense. What set him apart wasn't fancy legal jargon or polished speeches. It was his clarity. Lincoln had a rare ability to cut through the noise and get to the heart of the matter. Judges admired him, juries trusted him, and even his opponents respected him. One famous story tells of Lincoln turning down a case because he believed his client was in the wrong. "Yes, we can argue it," he said, "but we'll argue ourselves into a lie." That was Lincoln, a lawyer who valued truth above easy victories. His reputation grew, not just as a skilled attorney, but as an honest one, someone ordinary people could count on. While Lincoln's professional life was gaining momentum, his personal life was about to take a major turn. In Springfield, he met Mary Todd, a well-educated, spirited young woman from a prominent Kentucky family. Mary was intelligent, ambitious, and saw in Lincoln not just a country lawyer, but a man destined for greatness. Their courtship wasn't simple. It had its ups and downs, even a broken engagement at one point, but in 1842, Abraham and Mary married. Marriage brought joy, but it also brought challenges. Mary had a fiery personality that sometimes clashed with Lincoln's quieter, brooding nature. They had 4 sons, but heartbreak followed them too. Only one of their boys, Robert, survived into adulthood. The deaths of their children weighed heavily on both parents, deepening Lincoln's natural melancholy. Yet, despite the grief and strains, their bond endured. Mary became one of his fiercest supporters, often encouraging him when doubts clouded his path. Balancing law, politics, and family wasn't easy. Lincoln often traveled for weeks at a time as part of this circuit. riding horseback from town to town to argue cases in rural courthouses. He was away from home a lot, and the absences were hard on Mary, who managed the household and children largely on her own. Still, those years on the circuit toughened Lincoln's skills. He learned to connect with ordinary farmers, merchants, and townspeople. He became not just a liar, but a storyteller, weaving humor and humanity into his arguments. The Springfield years taught Lincoln lessons that would carry him through the storms ahead. Law sharpened his logic. Marriage tested his patience and resilience. Family loss deepened his empathy, and the constant demands of work and travel taught him discipline. Piece by piece, these experiences built the man who would one day carry the weight of a nation. The tall, awkward lawyer of Springfield was no longer just chasing opportunity. He was building a legacy. And soon, his small-town courtroom presence would expand to the biggest political stage in America. Chapter 5. Rising National Voice. There comes a moment in every great leader's journey when their voice rises above the crowd, when they stop speaking just for themselves and begin speaking for a nation. For Abraham Lincoln, that moment arrived as he stepped onto the national stage. No longer just the lawyer from Springfield or the state legislator in Illinois, he was about to become a voice America could not ignore. Lincoln's first taste of national politics came in 1846, when he won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. It was a short stint, just one term, but it gave him a window into the bigger battles shaping the country. He spoke out against the Mexican-American War, a stance that wasn't popular with everyone, and he raised his voice on the issue that would soon dominate his entire career, slavery. Though his time in Congress ended in 1849, it planted a seed. Lincoln now understood that his future wasn't just tied to Illinois. It was tied to America. For a while, Lincoln stepped back into law, but the storm clouds of slavery and division were gathering, and he could not stay silent. By the 1850s, the nation was splitting over the expansion of slavery into new territories. Could America remain half slave and half free, or would one side eventually triumph? These questions burned at Lincoln's heart. And in 1858, when he faced off against Senator Stephen A. Douglas in a series of debates, Lincoln's voice truly broke through. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were nothing short of electric. Crowds gathered by the thousands, often standing for hours in the heat, just to hear the two men clash over the future of the nation. Douglas was an experienced senator, confident and polished. Lincoln, tall and awkward, seemed like the underdog. But once he began to speak, the underdog rose to meet the moment. Lincoln argued that slavery was not just a political issue. It was a moral one. While Douglas believed in popular sovereignty, letting each state decide for itself, Lincoln warned that a nation built on freedom could not endure half in chains. His words cut deep, not just into Douglas's arguments, but into the conscience of the crowd. It was during this time that Lincoln delivered one of his most powerful lines in what became known as the House Divided speech. Standing before his supporters, he declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." These words shook the country. They were bold, direct, and risky. Some feared he was predicting civil war, but Lincoln was not predicting, he was warning. He saw clearly what others wanted to deny. The issue of slavery would decide America's future. Though Lincoln ultimately lost the Senate race to Douglas, the debates changed everything. Newspapers across the nation reprinted his speeches. His sharp logic, plain-spoken style, and moral clarity caught the attention of people far beyond Illinois. The lawyer from Springfield had become a national figure, admired by many and feared by others. What made Lincoln's voice so powerful was not just what he said, but how he said it. He didn't thunder like some politicians. Instead, he reasoned. He appealed to both the head and the heart. He used stories and humor to connect, but he never shied away from truth. And that combination, humility, honesty, and moral conviction, made his message unforgettable. By the end of the 1850s, Lincoln had transformed. He was no longer a local politician with modest ambitions. He was now seen as a man capable of leading in a time of crisis. His debates with Douglas, his House-divided speech, and his growing national reputation set the stage for the greatest leap of his life, the presidency. The world was beginning to listen, and Abraham Lincoln was ready to speak. Chapter 6. The Road to the Presidency. Some dreams are too big to stay hidden. For Abraham Lincoln, the log cabin boy from Kentucky, the rail splitter turned lawyer, the rising voice from Illinois, the dream of leading a nation was no longer distant. By 1860, the stage was set, the country was listening, and history was waiting for him to step forward. Lincoln wasn't the obvious choice for president. America was teetering on the edge of collapse, divided bitterly over slavery. The Democratic Party was split in two, with Northern Democrats backing Stephen A. Douglas and Southern Democrats choosing John C. Breckinridge. Another candidate, John Bell, tried to appeal to moderates who wanted to avoid conflict. Lincoln, representing the relatively young Republican Party, was seen as a fresh but risky option. After all, he had never held high national office. But he had something the others may have lacked: authenticity. He was a plain-spoken man who could speak to ordinary Americans with honesty and conviction. His campaign was unlike anything the country had seen before. While Lincoln stayed in Springfield, letting others spread his message, his supporters worked tirelessly. They printed posters, held rallies, and circulated his debates with Douglas. Newspapers carried his words far beyond Illinois. His humble story, born in poverty, self-educated, hard-working, became part of the campaign itself. Voters saw in him a reflection of their own struggles and hopes. The heart of Lincoln's campaign was simple yet powerful: stop the spread of slavery into new territories. He wasn't calling for its immediate abolition in the South, but he believed firmly that America could not grow stronger while chained to the institution of slavery. To many Northerners, this was common sense. To many Southerners, it was a threat to their way of life. And so the election of 1860 became not just a political contest, but a battle over the soul of the nation. Election day arrived in November 1860, and the results shocked many. Lincoln won the presidency with less than 40% of the popular vote, but he carried the North so strongly that it gave him a decisive victory in the Electoral College. In the South, his name hadn't even appeared on most ballots, yet he was now President-elect of the United States. It was a moment of triumph, but also a moment of crisis. For Lincoln, victory felt less like celebration and more like stepping into a storm. Before he could even take office, Southern states began seceding from the Union. South Carolina was the first, quickly followed by others. The very nation Lincoln had sworn to preserve was unraveling before his eyes. What made Lincoln remarkable was how he carried himself in this fragile moment. He didn't gloat over his win. He didn't attack his opponents. Instead, he spoke calmly, reassuringly, calling for unity. "We are not enemies, but friends," he would later say. "We must not be enemies." He knew the stakes were higher than politics. This was about whether the American experiment government of the people, by the people, for the people, could survive. Becoming the first Republican president was a monumental achievement. But the real challenge was only beginning. Lincoln had climbed from log cabin to White House, from self-taught farm boy to commander-in-chief. Yet what awaited him wasn't comfort or glory. It was war, heartbreak, and the burden of holding a divided nation together. The road to the presidency had ended, but the road through the fire was just beginning. Chapter 7. The War President. When Abraham Lincoln placed his hand on the Bible in March 1861 and swore the presidential oath, he was not stepping into calm waters, he was stepping into a raging storm. The Union was breaking apart. The air was thick with talk of war, and the very survival of America rested on his shoulders. This was no ordinary presidency. Lincoln would not simply lead. He would fight to hold the nation together, with every ounce of strength and conviction he possessed. The spark came quickly. In April 1861, Confederate cannons fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. For Lincoln, this was the test of his life. How do you lead a country that no longer agrees it should exist as one? How do you preserve freedom and unity when half the nation is willing to shed blood to destroy both? Lincoln's first challenge was the military. Though he was commander-in-chief, he had never served as a general. He had to rely on his top officers' men like George McClellan, Ulysses S. Grant, and William Tecumseh Sherman to carry out the fight. But leadership was never simple. Some generals, like McClellan, frustrated him with hesitation and endless excuses. McClellan built up a powerful army but refused to strike decisive blows. Lincoln, ever patient but firm, once remarked, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a time." It was Lincoln's persistence that kept the war effort alive in those early dark days. He studied maps, read military strategy, and spent long nights in the War Department telegraph office waiting for updates from the front. Slowly he grew into his role, not as a military man in uniform, but as the steady hand guiding the strategy from Washington. He knew when to push, when to encourage, and when to replace one general with another. He wasn't just learning war, he was learning how to lead men in the most desperate of circumstances. But the battlefield wasn't the only front. Lincoln also faced enormous political pressure. In the North, some believed he was too harsh, while others believed he wasn't harsh enough. Newspapers mocked him. Critics accused him of incompetence. Even within his own party, rivals plotted to take his place. Yet Lincoln did what he had always done. He listened, he weighed carefully, and then he acted with conviction. Perhaps his greatest weapon wasn't the Union Army, but his words. Lincoln had the ability to inspire hope when hope seemed impossible. He spoke not only to politicians and generals, but to ordinary people, the farmers, workers, and families who had given their sons to the fight. His speeches reminded them why the struggle mattered. This wasn't just a war about states or borders. It was about the very idea of America, about whether a free nation could endure. The war was brutal. Thousands died in battles like Bull Run, Shiloh, and Antietam. Each casualty weighed heavily on Lincoln's heart. He carried the grief of the nation on his own weary shoulders. Yet he never faltered in his purpose. He believed the Union must survive, not for glory or power, but for the principle that democracy could stand the test of fire. Lincoln did not choose to be a war president. History forced it upon him. But he embraced the role with courage, patience, and relentless determination. In every telegram, every order, every speech, he showed that leadership is not about knowing all the answers. It is about standing firm when the ground beneath you shakes. The cannons had roared, the war had begun, and Abraham Lincoln stood tall in the storm. He was not just a president anymore. He was the guardian of a nation fighting for its soul. Chapter 8. The Emancipator. Some moments in history do more than change laws. They change the very heartbeat of a nation. For Abraham Lincoln, that moment came with the stroke of a pen in 1863. Up to that point, the Civil War had been about saving the Union. But with the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln gave the war and America itself a deeper meaning. It was no longer just a fight to preserve the United States. It was a battle to redefine freedom. Lincoln had long despised slavery. From his earliest days, he had called it a moral wrong, a system that chained human beings and mocked the nation's promise of liberty. Yet as president, he tread carefully. He knew that if he moved too quickly, border states that still allowed slavery, but remained loyal to the Union, might turn against him. Timing was everything. The turning point came after the bloody Battle of Antietam in September 1862. Though not a sweeping victory, it gave Lincoln the momentum he needed. In January 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate-controlled states shall be thenceforward, and forever free. It was bold, it was risky, and it transformed the war. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't free every enslaved person immediately. Its reach was limited to areas under rebellion, but it sent a thunderous message. The Union was now fighting not only for survival, but also for justice. The moral ground shifted beneath the Confederacy's feet. The world was watching, and Lincoln had made it clear that America would not be a nation half slave and half free. The impact was enormous. Thousands of enslaved men, women, and children fled to Union lines seeking freedom. Many of the men joined the Union Army, proving themselves fierce and courageous fighters. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors had served, their bravery helping to turn the tide of battle. Lincoln often said that without them, the Union might not have survived. The proclamation also reshaped Lincoln's relationship with abolitionists. Many who had criticized him for moving too slowly now rallied to his side. Leaders like Frederick Douglass praised Lincoln's courage, even while pushing him to go further. Lincoln, in turn, grew in his respect for Douglass and other black leaders. He listened to them, welcomed them to the White House, and came to see the fight against slavery as inseparable from the fight for union. Yet Lincoln was not blind to the challenges ahead. He knew freedom on paper was only the first step. The question remained, what would freedom mean in practice? How would millions of formerly enslaved people build new lives in a land that had once treated them as property? Lincoln wrestled with these questions, even as the war raged on. Through it all, he kept his moral compass steady. The Emancipation Proclamation was not just a military measure, it was a declaration of the nation's soul. It aligned America with its founding ideals, even as the country bled to make them real. Lincoln had taken a stand that risked everything: political support, military alliances, even the fragile unity of the North. But in doing so, he redefined what it meant to be president, what it meant to be American, and what it meant to fight for freedom. With one proclamation, Abraham Lincoln became more than a war leader. He became the great emancipator, the man who gave voice to liberty when silence was no longer an option. Chapter 9: Victory and Tragedy. Great leaders often shine brightest in the final stretch of their journey. For Abraham Lincoln, the year 1864 was one of exhaustion, doubt, and yet triumph. The Civil War had dragged on for 3 bloody years, testing the patience of the North and pushing the nation to the brink. Many believed Lincoln would not survive politically, yet he not only endured but rose higher, carrying the Union toward victory. The presidential election of 1864 was no easy fight. War weariness ran deep, and critics accused Lincoln of dragging the country through endless bloodshed. Some within his own party even plotted to replace him on the ticket. Yet Lincoln remained steady. He believed in the cause and trusted the American people to see it through. His campaign promise was simple but powerful: finish the fight, end the war, and preserve the Union. The tide turned when Union General Ulysses S. Grant pressed hard against Confederate armies, and General William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta. These victories revived Northern confidence, and Lincoln's message of perseverance rang true. In November, the people spoke. He was re-elected with a sweeping majority, proving that America still trusted his leadership, even in its darkest days. The second term began with hope. Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction was strikingly generous. He wanted to heal, not punish. His plan called for amnesty and reintegration, offering Southern states a path back into the Union if they accepted the end of slavery. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he declared in his second inaugural address, urging the nation to bind up its wounds and move forward together. It was one of the most compassionate political visions ever spoken, born from Lincoln's deep humanity and unshakable belief in reconciliation. By the spring of 1865, the war was drawing to a close. Grant pressed Robert E. Lee's Confederate forces to surrender, and on April 9th at Appomattox Courthouse, the unthinkable happened. The Confederacy collapsed. After 4 years of unimaginable suffering, the Union was saved. Lincoln's dream of a nation conceived in liberty had survived the fire. But history can be cruel. Just days after Lee's surrender, the president who had guided America through its darkest hour would not live to see the peace he longed to build. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He was weary but hopeful, having spoken just days before about new beginnings for the country. As he sat in the presidential box, an assassin slipped in John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer who despised Lincoln's vision. With one gunshot, the joyous celebration of victory turned into national mourning. Lincoln died the next morning, April 15, 1865. The news spread like wildfire, plunging the country into shock and grief. Bells tolled, cities draped themselves in black, and millions wept for the man who had become not just their president, but their symbol of endurance, justice, and unity. His assassination was more than the death of a leader. It was the silencing of a voice that had called America to its better self. Yet in death, as in life, Lincoln's influence only grew. His legacy as the savior of the Union and the great emancipator became immortal, etched into the very identity of the nation. Victory and tragedy had collided in the spring of 1865. The Union was preserved, slavery was ended, and freedom's promise had been renewed. But it came at the cost of Lincoln's life, the final, ultimate sacrifice of a leader who gave everything for the country he loved. Chapter 10. Legacy that Lives On. Some leaders leave office and fade into history. Abraham Lincoln did the opposite. His legacy grew larger with each passing year. More than 150 years after his death, his shadow still stretches across American life, shaping the nation's democracy, inspiring movements for justice, and serving as a timeless example of what true leadership looks like. Lincoln's greatest gift to America was not just that he saved the Union, it was that he redefined what the Union meant. Before him, many saw the United States as a fragile collection of states loosely bound together. Lincoln insisted it was more. It was one nation indivisible, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. His leadership through the Civil War ensured that democracy itself survived the greatest test it ever faced. By preserving the Union, Lincoln preserved the experiment of self-government. The world was watching in the 1860s. Monarchies and empires doubted that a republic built on liberty could endure civil strife. When Lincoln held the country together, he proved them wrong. America would live on as a beacon of democracy, stronger because of the trial it had survived. And then there was emancipation. Lincoln will forever be remembered as the great emancipator, the man who turned the tide of history by declaring that slavery must end. His Emancipation Proclamation opened the door to freedom for millions and set the stage for the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in every corner of the United States. This act reshaped the nation's moral identity, ensuring that freedom was not just a promise on paper but a reality for all. The echoes of Lincoln's courage rang through future generations. Leaders of the civil rights movement, from Frederick Douglass in the 19th century to Martin Luther King, Jr. in the 20th, looked to Lincoln as a source of inspiration. King's famous words at the Lincoln Memorial, "I have a dream," were spoken in the shadow of the man who had once declared that a house divided could not stand. Lincoln's spirit lived on in every march, every speech, and every act of courage that sought to make America more just. But Lincoln's legacy is not only about democracy and freedom, it's also about leadership. He showed the world that greatness comes not from wealth, privilege, or background, but from character. Born in a log cabin, largely self-taught, often underestimated, he rose not by entitlement, but by perseverance and honesty. His nickname, Honest Abe, was not just a campaign slogan. It was who he was. He proved that integrity, humility, and vision could guide a leader through the most impossible of storms. Modern politicians, regardless of party, still invoke his name. Statues and memorials honor him. His words like the Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural remain among the most quoted speeches in history. Each generation finds something new in Lincoln, a defender of freedom, a healer of wounds, a symbol of unity. Lincoln's story is a reminder that leadership is not about being perfect. It is about rising to the challenge when history calls. He faced doubts, failures, and unthinkable pressure, yet he never lost sight of the larger purpose, to preserve liberty and justice for all. Today, when people walk past the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., they see more than stone and marble. They see a man whose life proves that even in the darkest times, hope can endure, freedom can triumph, and a single individual's courage can change the course of history. Abraham Lincoln may have been taken too soon, but his legacy is eternal. The great emancipator still speaks through his words, through his deeds, and through the enduring dream of a nation united in freedom. Now, that brings us to the end of this amazing story. Stories have a magic all their own. They take us beyond textbooks, beyond grammar drills, and into the heart of human experience. Abraham Lincoln's journey from a log cabin in Kentucky to the White House, from a self-taught boy to the great emancipator, shows us what's possible when curiosity, courage, and perseverance guide our steps. Learning English through stories like Lincoln's isn't just about vocabulary or grammar. It's about connecting with ideas, emotions, and moments in history. Each sentence you read, each dialogue you follow, trains your mind to think, imagine, and express yourself in English. Stories give language life. They make words memorable because they're tied to people, struggles, triumphs, and lessons that stay with you. Lincoln's life teaches more than history. It teaches resilience. He faced poverty, loss, criticism, and immense pressure, yet he never stopped learning, speaking, or striving. In the same way, learning a new language can feel difficult at times. You might stumble, forget words, or misunderstand a sentence. But each challenge is part of the journey. Every word you learn, every sentence you speak is a step toward fluency. Let Lincoln's story inspire you. Notice how he read constantly, practiced, and applied knowledge in real-life situations. You can do the same with English. Read, listen, speak, and write. Immerse yourself in stories, conversations, and ideas. Let curiosity guide you, not fear. Mistakes are not failures. They are stepping stones, just as every misstep was part of Lincoln's rise. Language learning, like leadership, requires patience, persistence, and passion. You may start small, with a single phrase or a short paragraph. But as you keep going, as you practice consistently, your confidence will grow. Soon you'll understand more, speak more clearly, and even tell your own stories in English. Stories that can inspire others just as Lincoln's story inspires us. So keep reading, keep listening, keep speaking. Let the stories of the past of leaders, dreamers, and ordinary people achieving extraordinary things be your guide. Through them, you don't just learn English, you learn to think, to feel, and to express yourself in ways that reach hearts and minds. By reading Lincoln's story, you can learn important lessons. 1. Never give up, even when the odds are against you. 2. Keep learning every day, because knowledge gives you power and confidence. 3. Use your voice with honesty and courage, just like Lincoln spoke for what was right. 4. Small steps lead to big results. Every effort counts, whether it's reading a new word or trying a new sentence. 5. Believe in yourself, because determination and hard work can change your life, just like Lincoln changed a nation.